The cat interrupts the funeral by starting to meow loudly at the coffin. When a man questions the reason, the museum staff becomes nervous. And then this man discovers a shocking secret. It was a gray autumn day, and the sky seemed as somber as everyone present at Professor William Harrison's funeral. The respected museum director had dedicated his entire life to preserving history and culture in the small town of Millbrook. People stood in complete silence around his casket, some holding handkerchiefs, while others with tear-filled eyes remembered every moment they had shared with the beloved professor. The wind blew gently through the cemetery, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees as if nature itself was paying its final respects. Suddenly, an unexpected sound broke the solemn silence. It was Duchess, the museum's resident cat. She had been Professor Harrison's constant companion for over 8 years, living in the museum and becoming as much a part of the institution as the artifacts themselves. Duchess began meowing loudly and insistently, her green eyes fixed directly on the coffin. She wasn't just making ordinary cat sounds. These were deep, almost human-like cries that seemed to carry an urgent message. The mourners looked at each other with surprise and growing unease. What could she be trying to tell them? Some whispered among themselves, disturbed by the cat's behavior. Duchess paced back and forth near the coffin, her tail twitching with agitation, but her gaze never left the wooden box. Her meowing grew louder and more desperate, as if she were trying to warn everyone about something they couldn't see or understand. Duchess was no ordinary cat. Everyone in Millbrook knew about her intelligence and almost supernatural intuition. She had been found as a kitten in the museum's basement by Professor Harrison himself. And since then, she had developed an uncanny ability to sense things that escaped human perception. The townspeople had witnessed her behavior before. During emergencies, she had once alerted the fire department to a gas leak by refusing to leave a specific area of the museum. And another time, she had guided a lost child back to safety during a thunderstorm. Some of the children present began to feel a chill down their spines, remembering all the stories they had heard about animals that could sense supernatural presences. The adults, too, began to feel uncomfortable as Duchess continued her persistent meowing, her behavior suggesting that something was terribly wrong. Her eyes seemed to hold a wisdom beyond her years, and the intensity of her gaze made even the most skeptical people hesitate. Dr. Margaret Thornton, the museum's assistant director, stood near the front of the gathering. She had worked closely with Professor Harrison for 15 years and had been devastated by his sudden death. Now, watching Duchess's strange behavior, she felt a growing sense of unease. The cat had never acted this way before, not even during the professor's illness. Margaret approached Duchess, trying to calm her down with gentle words, but the cat backed away. Continuing to meow while keeping her eyes locked on the coffin, Margaret tried to maintain her composure, but beads of sweat began to form on her forehead despite the cool autumn air. She gestured to some of the museum staff members, asking them to help remove Duchess from the ceremony. However, every time someone approached the cat, she would dart away, only to return moments later to continue her vocal protest. It was as if she was determined to make everyone understand that something was wrong, something that no one else could see. Among the crowd stood a man who seemed slightly out of place. His name was Detective James Mitchell, a retired investigator, who had recently moved to Millbrook after spending 30 years solving complex cases in the city. He had come to pay his respects to Professor Harrison, whom he had met briefly during his first week in town. James had always been drawn to mysteries, and his sharp investigative instincts had not dulled with retirement. Watching Duchess's behavior, he immediately sensed that there was more to this situation than met the eye. James observed the cat carefully, noting the specific direction of her gaze and the urgency in her voice. He had worked with canine units during his career and had developed a deep respect for animals' intuitive abilities. Something about Duchess's behavior, reminded him of the way police dogs acted when they detected something significant at a crime scene. The cat wasn't just grieving. She was trying to communicate something important. Dr. Thornton, growing increasingly flustered, raised her voice above the cat's meowing. "Please, everyone, let's continue with the ceremony. Duchess is just confused and upset by the loss of Professor Harrison. This is perfectly normal behavior for a pet who has lost their owner." But even as she spoke these words, her voice trembled slightly, and she avoided making direct eye contact with the coffin. James stepped forward, his detective instincts taking over. He crouched down near Duchess, speaking in a calm, reassuring voice. "What is it, girl? What are you trying to tell us?" To everyone's surprise, Duchess stopped meowing for a moment and looked directly at James, as if she recognized that he was someone who might actually listen to her. Her green eyes seemed to plead with him, and then she did something that made everyone gasp. She walked over to the coffin and gently placed her paw on the wood, as if she were trying to open it. The crowd murmured in shock and confusion. Some people crossed themselves, while others whispered about supernatural occurrences. James felt a chill run down his spine as he watched the cat's deliberate actions. In his years of investigating, he had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, every instinct was telling him that something was very wrong with this funeral. Dr. Thornton's face turned pale. As she watched the scene unfold, she quickly moved toward the coffin, trying to position herself between Duchess and the wooden box. "This is highly inappropriate," she said, her voice now clearly shaking. "We need to remove the cat immediately and continue with the service. Professor Harrison deserves to be laid to rest in peace." But James was not easily deterred. He had noticed the subtle changes in Dr. Thornton's behavior, the way she avoided looking at the coffin, the nervous perspiration, the tremor in her voice. These were all signs he had learned to recognize during his decades of investigation. He stood up slowly and addressed the crowd in a clear, authoritative voice that carried the weight of his years of experience. "I think we should listen to what Duchess is trying to tell us," James said, his eyes scanning the faces of the mourners. "In my experience, animals often sense things that we humans miss. She's not just upset about losing Professor Harrison. She's trying to warn us about something specific." The crowd fell silent, torn between their desire to complete the funeral ceremony and their curiosity about what the cat might be trying to communicate. James could see the conflict in their faces. But he also noticed something else. Several of the museum staff members looked nervous, exchanging glances with each other in a way that suggested they might know more than they were letting on. Dr. Thornton stepped forward, her authority as the museum's assistant director evident in her posture. "Detective Mitchell, I appreciate your concern, but this is neither the time nor the place for such speculation. We are here to honor Professor Harrison's memory, not to indulge in superstitious nonsense. The cat is simply grieving, and we should respect that." But James had caught something in her tone, a defensive quality that reminded him of suspects who were trying too hard to appear innocent. He decided to press further, using the questioning techniques that had served him well throughout his career. "Dr. Thornton, I'm curious about the circumstances of Professor Harrison's death. Could you tell us exactly how and when he passed away?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Dr. Thornton's eyes widened slightly, and she glanced nervously at the other museum staff members before answering. "Professor Harrison died peacefully in his sleep at his home. I was the one who found him the next morning when he didn't come to work. What a heart attack, completely natural for someone his age." James nodded thoughtfully, but his experienced. "I caught several inconsistencies in her story." "That must have been very difficult for you, Dr. Thornton. How did you have access to his home? Did he give you a key?" The question clearly caught her off guard. She stammered for a moment before responding. "Well, we were close colleagues. He had given me a spare key for emergencies, in case something happened at the museum, and I needed to reach him. As she spoke, Duchess began meowing again, this time even more insistently. The cat approached James and began rubbing against his legs, as if she were trying to get his attention. Then she did something remarkable. She walked toward the museum, which was visible in the distance, and looked back at James as if she wanted him to follow her. James felt a surge of excitement. In his experience, this kind of behavior from an animal usually meant they were trying to lead someone to something important. He looked at the crowd and then at Dr. Thornton, whose face had gone from pale to ashen. "I think Duchess wants to show us something at the museum," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Dr. Thornton quickly moved to block his path. "Absolutely not. The museum is closed today out of respect for Professor Harrison. Besides, we have a funeral to complete. This has gone far enough." But James was not deterred. He had spent too many years following leads and trusting his instincts to ignore such obvious signs. "Dr. Thornton, I find it interesting that you're so adamant about preventing us from following the cat. If there's nothing to hide, why not let us take a quick look?" The crowd was now fully engaged in the unfolding drama. Some people nodded in agreement with James, while others looked uncertain. The museum staff members huddled together, whispering urgently among themselves. The tension in the air was palpable, and even the children could sense that something significant was happening. Duchess seemed to understand that she had an ally in James. She meowed once more and then began walking determinedly toward the museum, pausing every few steps to look back and make sure he was following. James made his decision. "I'm going to follow her," he announced to the crowd. "Anyone who wants to come along is welcome to join me." Dr. Thornton's composure finally cracked. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cemetery. "This is private property, and you have no right to enter the museum without permission." But it was too late. Several members of the crowd, their curiosity overcoming their hesitation, began to follow James and Duchess toward the museum. The cat seemed pleased with this development, her tail held high as she led the growing procession away from the cemetery. As they walked, James couldn't help but notice how the museum staff members remained behind, clustering around Dr. Thornton and the coffin. Their behavior only reinforced his suspicions that something was seriously wrong. He had learned long ago that innocent people rarely acted so defensively when faced with simple questions. The museum stood before them, its classical architecture looking somehow more imposing in the gray afternoon light. Duchess sat in front of the main entrance, looking up at James expectantly. Dr. Thornton and several staff members had followed the group, clearly anxious about what might be discovered inside. James turned to face Dr. Thornton, his detective instincts now fully engaged. "Dr. Thornton, I'd like to ask you some more questions about Professor Harrison's death. You mentioned that you found him at his home, but I'm curious about the timeline. When exactly did you discover his body, and how long had he been dead?" The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She glanced around nervously, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. I don't see how that's relevant to the current situation. We should return to the cemetery and complete the funeral service." But James pressed on, his years of experience telling him that he was close to uncovering something significant. "The thing is, Dr. Thornton, in my experience, when someone is being evasive about simple questions, it's usually because they have something to hide. Now, Duchess here seems to think there's something important we need to see inside the museum. Why don't we take a look?" Duchess meowed in apparent agreement and began pawing at the museum's front door. James noticed that Dr. Thornton had keys hanging from her belt, keys that would presumably give them access to the building. The crowd watched in fascination as the drama continued to unfold. One of the townspeople, an elderly man named Harold, who had known Professor Harrison for decades, stepped forward. "I think Detective Mitchell has a point," he said, in a voice that carried the weight of his years. "If there's nothing to hide, why not let us see what the cat wants to show us?" Professor Harrison always said that Duchess was special, that she could sense things others couldn't. Dr. Thornton looked around desperately, but she could see that the crowd was against her. Reluctantly, she pulled out her keys and unlocked the museum's front door. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, "but this is highly irregular. And I want everyone to know that I'm only doing this under protest." The museum's interior was dimly lit, filled with a musty scent of old artifacts and polished wood. Display cases lined the walls, containing everything from ancient pottery to Civil War memorabilia. Duchess immediately began moving through the museum with purpose, her paws making soft padding sounds on the marble floor. James followed closely behind, his trained eye taking in every detail of the surroundings. The museum was well maintained and organized, exactly what he would have expected from someone with Professor Harrison's reputation. But as they moved deeper into the building, he began to notice small details that seemed out of place. Duchess led them through the main gallery and toward the back of the museum, where Professor Harrison's office was located. The cat stopped in front of a large display case that contained what appeared to be a collection of valuable ancient artifacts: Greek pottery, Roman coins, and Egyptian jewelry. She began meowing again, this time directing her attention specifically toward the display case. James examined the case more closely and noticed something interesting. While most of the display cases in the museum had small plaques describing the artifacts and their origins, this particular case had no such documentation. The artifacts themselves looked genuine and valuable, but there was no information about where they had come from or how they had been acquired. "Dr. Thornton," James said, turning to face her, "could you tell us about these artifacts? They seem quite valuable, but I don't see any information about their provenance." Dr. Thornton's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, fear, and finally resignation. Those are part of Professor Harrison's private collection. He was planning to donate them to the museum, but the paperwork hadn't been completed yet. James nodded thoughtfully, but something about her explanation didn't ring true. In his experience, legitimate private collections always came with detailed documentation about their origins and acquisition. The absence of such documentation was often a red flag indicating that the artifacts might have been obtained through questionable means. Duchess seemed to sense that they were on the right track. She began pawing at the base of the display case, as if she were trying to get their attention focused on something specific. James crouched down to examine the area more closely and noticed that one of the floorboards near the case looked slightly different from the others, newer, as if it had been recently replaced. "That's interesting," James murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "Dr. Thornton, has there been any recent construction or renovation work done in this area of the museum?" The question seemed to catch her completely off guard. She stammered for a moment before responding, I don't recall any recent work being done in this area. Why do you ask?" James pointed to the floorboard he had noticed. "This board looks newer than the others. It's a slightly different shade of wood, and the finish doesn't quite match. In my experience, when someone replaces a single floorboard in an otherwise original floor, it's usually because they needed to access something underneath." The crowd that had followed them into the museum began to murmur with excitement. They could sense that James was onto something significant, and the tension in the air was palpable. Duchess continued to meow and paw at the area, as if she were trying to encourage them to investigate further. Dr. Thornton looked around desperately, clearly searching for some way to deflect attention from the suspicious floorboard. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising with panic. "We're desecrating Professor Harrison's memory with these wild speculations. I demand that everyone leave the museum immediately." But James was not about to be deterred. He had spent too many years following leads and uncovering secrets to ignore such obvious signs. Dr. Thornton, I think it would be in everyone's best interest if we took a look under this floorboard. If there's nothing to hide, then we'll find nothing and put this matter to rest. Harold, the elderly townsman who had spoken up earlier, stepped forward. I agree with Detective Mitchell. Professor Harrison was a good man, and if there's something here that might explain what happened to him, we owe it to his memory to find out what it is. Several other members of the crowd nodded in agreement, and James could see that Dr. Thornton was outnumbered. She looked around frantically, as if searching for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. The museum staff members who had accompanied them from the cemetery hung back, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to openly challenge the crowd's determination. James found a crowbar in the museum's maintenance closet and carefully pried up the suspicious floorboard. What he found underneath made everyone gasp in shock. There was a small cavity beneath the floor, and inside it was a metal box similar to the one that had been found in the original story. But this box contained something even more surprising. It was filled with official-looking documents, photographs, and what appeared to be a substantial amount of cash. Duchess seemed pleased with the discovery. She rubbed against James's leg, purring, as if she were congratulating him on finding what she had been trying to show them all along. James carefully lifted the box out of its hiding place and set it on a nearby table where everyone could see it. Dr. Thornton, James said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his years of investigative experience. I think you need to explain what this is and why it was hidden under the floor of the museum. Dr. Thornton's composure finally collapsed completely. She sank into a nearby chair, her face buried in her hands. I never meant for any of this to happen, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It all started so innocently, but then it got out of control, and I didn't know how to stop it. James opened the box and began examining its contents. The documents appeared to be bills of sale and authentication certificates for various artifacts. But many of them looked suspicious. The signatures were inconsistent, the dates seemed questionable, and some of the documentation appeared to have been forged. Dr. Thornton, James said gently but firmly, I think you need to tell us the truth about what's been happening here. These documents suggest that valuable artifacts have been sold illegally. And this money, he gestured to the cash in the box, suggests that this has been going on for some time. The crowd listened in stunned silence as Dr. Thornton began to tell her story. She explained how she had initially begun selling minor artifacts to help fund museum operations during budget cuts. What had started as a desperate attempt to keep the museum running had gradually escalated into a full-scale operation involving the theft and sale of valuable pieces from the museum's collection. Professor Harrison found out about what I was doing, she continued, tears streaming down her face. He confronted me about the missing artifacts and threatened to expose everything. I couldn't let that happen. It would have meant the end of my career, criminal charges, and the destruction of everything I had worked for. James felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand the full scope of what had happened. Dr. Thornton, are you telling us that Professor Harrison didn't die of natural causes? She looked up at him with eyes full of anguish and guilt. I never meant to hurt him. I just wanted to talk to him, to convince him to keep quiet about what he had discovered. But he was so angry, so determined to do the right thing. We argued, and he threatened to call the police immediately. I panicked. And her voice trailed off. The silence in the museum was deafening. Everyone stood frozen, trying to process what they had just heard. James felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with uncovering a serious crime. He had solved many cases during his career, but this one felt particularly tragic because it involved the betrayal of trust within a small, close-knit community. Dr. Thornton, James said quietly, I need you to tell us exactly what happened to Professor Harrison." She took a shuddering breath before continuing. "We were in his office late one evening, arguing about the stolen artifacts. He was so angry, and he kept saying that he was going to call the police and that I would go to prison. I was desperate. I knew that if he exposed me, it would destroy everything. In my panic, I grabbed a heavy paperweight from his desk and I struck him with it." The crowd gasped collectively, and several people stepped backward as if they were trying to distance themselves from the horrible truth. James felt a familiar mixture of sadness and determination. Sadness for the tragedy that had unfolded, and determination to see that justice was served. After he fell and I realized what I had done, I panicked completely. Dr. Thornton continued. "I couldn't call for help because I knew I would be arrested. So I moved his body to his home and made it look like he had died in his sleep. I knew enough about forensic science to know that if I waited a few hours before discovering the body, it would be much harder to determine the exact time of death." James nodded grimly. He had seen similar cases before, crimes of passion that were then covered up through careful staging. And the funeral today. "I thought if we could just get through the funeral, everything would be over. No one would ever know what really happened, and I could figure out how to return the stolen artifacts gradually over time. But then Duchess started acting strangely, and I knew something was wrong." James looked down at the cat, who was now sitting calmly beside the opened box, as if she were satisfied that her message had finally been understood. How did Duchess know what had happened? Dr. Thornton's voice was barely a whisper. She was there that night. She was sleeping in Professor Harrison's office when I came to talk to him. She saw everything that happened. After the professor died, she wouldn't leave his side. She kept meowing and trying to wake him up. I had to force her away so I could move his body. The pieces of the puzzle were now falling into place. James understood why Duchess had been so agitated at the funeral. She had been trying to tell everyone that Professor Harrison hadn't died naturally. That something terrible had happened to him. The cat had been the only witness to the crime, and her instincts had driven her to try to communicate the truth to anyone who would listen. "Dr. Thornton," James said solemnly, "you need to come with me to the police station. We need to report this crime officially, and you need to make a full statement about what happened." She nodded weakly, seeming almost relieved that the truth was finally out. "I know. I've been living with this guilt for weeks, and I couldn't bear it anymore. In a way, I'm grateful that Duchess forced the truth to come out. Professor Harrison deserved better than to be buried with everyone thinking he had just died of old age." As they prepared to leave the museum, James couldn't help but marvel at the intelligence and loyalty of the remarkable cat who had solved the case. Duchess had not only witnessed the crime, but had also found a way to communicate the truth to the humans around her. Her behavior at the funeral had been the key that unlocked the entire mystery. The crowd slowly filed out of the museum, their minds reeling from the shocking revelations they had just witnessed. What had started as a simple funeral had turned into the uncovering of a major crime. All because one intelligent cat had refused to let an injustice go unaddressed. Harold, the elderly townsman who had supported James's investigation, approached him as they exited the museum. "Detective Mitchell, I want to thank you for listening to what Duchess was trying to tell us. If you hadn't been here, Dr. Thornton might have gotten away with murder." James smiled sadly. "In my experience, the truth has a way of coming out eventually. Sometimes it just needs a little help from unexpected sources." He looked down at Duchess, who was walking beside him with her tail held high. "In this case, we had a very special witness who refused to let the truth be buried." As they walked back toward the cemetery, James reflected on the events of the day. He had come to Professor Harrison's funeral expecting to pay his respects to a man he had barely known. Instead, he had uncovered a tragic crime that had shaken the entire community to its core. But he also felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that justice would be served and that Professor Harrison's true cause of death would not remain a secret. Dr. Thornton was arrested and charged with murder and theft. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of her crimes. Dozens of valuable artifacts had been stolen from the museum and sold to private collectors around the world. The money from these sales had been used partly to fund her own lifestyle and partly to cover up the evidence of her crimes. The museum was closed temporarily while a full inventory was conducted, and efforts were made to recover the stolen artifacts. The community rallied together to support the institution that Professor Harrison had loved so much, raising funds to help restore the collection and ensure that the museum could continue its important work. Duchess became something of a local celebrity, with people coming from far and wide to see the cat who had solved a murder case. She was given a special place of honor in the museum, with her own comfortable bed and a plaque that read, "Duchess, Guardian of Truth and Justice." James decided to stay in Millbrook permanently, feeling that he had found a community where his skills and experience were valued. He worked with the local police department as a consultant, helping to solve cold cases and train younger officers in investigative techniques. But he never forgot the lesson he had learned from Duchess, that sometimes the most important witnesses are the ones who can't speak for themselves. The story of Duchess and the museum mystery became legendary in Millbrook, passed down from generation to generation as a reminder that justice will always find a way to prevail, even when it seems impossible. The cat had not only solved a crime, but had also restored faith in the power of truth and the importance of listening to those who might otherwise go unheard. Professor Harrison was finally laid to rest with dignity and honor, his true cause of death acknowledged and his killer brought to justice. The community mourned not only for the loss of a beloved figure, but also for the betrayal of trust that had led to his death. But they also celebrated the remarkable intelligence and loyalty of the cat who had refused to let an injustice stand. Years later, when people told the story of how Duchess solved the museum mystery, it would always emphasize the importance of paying attention to the signs around us and listening to those who might be trying to tell us something important. The cat had shown them that truth and justice could come from the most unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most powerful voices belong to those who cannot speak with words. In the end, the mystery of Professor Harrison's death was solved not by sophisticated forensic science or complex detective work, but by the simple determination of a loyal cat who refused to let her beloved human's killer go unpunished. It was a reminder that justice often comes from the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the greatest mysteries are solved by those who love us most.